If you want to understand how governments usually expand taxation, do not begin by asking who gets hit first. Begin by asking what mechanism they are trying to legalize. That is where the real danger lives. The public is almost always shown the same bait. A small group, a politically convenient group, a group easy to resent and easy to isolate. The rich, the billionaire, the speculator, the person with too much. That is how the conversation always starts. It never starts by saying, we are building a framework that may eventually require the state to value, catalog, and reach into the stock of private wealth that ordinary people thought they actually owned. That truth arrives later, usually after the argument is already won. That is the mother line. The true risk is not a tax that begins. The true risk is a system that teaches the state how to value and tax what you own, not just what you earn. That is a much bigger thing, because once the state crosses that line, the entire relationship between citizen and property changes. Income taxes are already invasive enough. At least income begins with a flow. You earn something this year, the government takes a slice, and the citizen tries to live with what remains. I do not admire it, but that is the logic. A wealth tax or any framework that starts measuring the value of what you already possess is something else entirely. It is not just taxing motion, it is taxing existence. That is a different philosophy of ownership. And once you understand that, this source document stops looking like a loud political rant and starts looking like a warning about administrative power. The document opens with a story from the old mining world. Canary in the coal mine, toxic gas arrives before men can feel it. The bird drops. Smart people do not form a committee. They leave fine. The metaphor is dramatic, but the strategic point is sound. When a jurisdiction begins experimenting with a tax structure that requires more detailed state knowledge of personal assets, more frequent valuation, and more political permission to harvest net worth directly, you should not laugh because it begins with billionaires. You should pay attention because it begins with a mechanism. That is the first mechanism I want you to understand. I call it the threshold ratchet. Public policy rarely arrives fully grown. It begins in a form voters can tolerate, small, targeted, framed as fairness, sold as temporary, limited only to people the majority does not identify with. That is how an income tax began in this country. A tiny rate, a tiny slice of the population, the rich only. It sounded reasonable, it sounded containable, and then time did what time always does in politics. Crises arrived, spending rose. The state learned that once the tool exists, the temptation to widen it becomes almost irresistible. That is the lesson history teaches without mercy. The threshold moves, the rate moves, the definition of rich moves, and eventually the tax that started as moral theater at the top becomes normal operating pressure for everyone below. That is what scares me here, not because I believe tomorrow morning a wealth tax will hit every homeowner in America, because I have seen what happens once the mechanism is legitimized at all. Politicians are not rewarded for building tools they never use again. They are rewarded for promising new benefits, preserving old promises, and locating new pools of money once the old pools run dry. That is what governments do when obligations outrun discipline. They do not begin with austerity. They begin with new definitions of what can be taxed. Now bring that back to the House. Most people still think their home sits outside this conversation because they picture wealth tax as a problem for billionaires with private jets and stock portfolios. That is a comforting story. It is also the wrong story. The House is not protected by invisibility. In fact, the House is almost the easiest asset to target if the political appetite ever broadens. Why? Because houses do not move. Titles or public assessments already exist. Counties already know where you live, what parcel you own, what the tax history is, and what they think the market value should be. The machinery for recurring property-based extraction is already halfway built. That matters, because the moment a government becomes more interested in taxing net worth rather than only annual income, the home stops being just shelter. It becomes a visible reservoir. That is the second mechanism. I call it the assessment bridge. A state does not need to invent an entirely new relationship with your home to reach for more of its value. It only needs to extend the logic of assessment. Property tax already trains people to accept a strange arrangement. You may own the house, but every year the state reassesses some version of its value and sends you a bill to keep living inside it. Miss enough bills, and the state reminds you how conditional ownership can be. Most people have normalized this so completely that they do not hear how radical it is. Pay annually for something you supposedly own outright. Now imagine taking that same logic and stretching it further. Not only the existing property tax system, but a broader framework where home equity itself becomes politically visible in a new way. Suddenly, the argument is no longer just about local services and county budgets. It becomes about fairness, unrealized wealth, social contribution, and all the soft language governments use when they want to describe private assets as a resource base. That is where the danger becomes personal. Because once your house is no longer viewed primarily as a home, but also as trapped value available for social harvesting, then the entire meaning of retirement, homeownership, and family wealth changes. That is what most people still fail to grasp. The family home is not merely an emotional object for a huge part of the country. It is the paid-off asset, the buffer against rent inflation, the anchor that makes retirement survivable, the thing that can be borrowed against in an emergency, sold in widowhood, transferred to children, or downsized later for flexibility. If the state starts moving philosophically toward the idea that accumulated home equity is simply another stock of value, fair game for extraction, then the middle class is not outside the blast radius. It is the eventual target. That is not alarmism. That is pattern recognition. This is the third mechanism. I call it the inventory state. In order to tax wealth, the state must first see wealth not vaguely. Specifically, what do you own? What is it worth? How often is that value updated? What documents prove the value? What structures hide the value? What transfers can be scrutinized? Which trusts, LLCs, partnerships, retirement accounts, personal property categories, collectibles, second homes, business interests, and equity positions. Count a wealth tax is not merely a rate question. It is an information question. And once the state builds the informational machinery, the machinery itself becomes power. This is the point many people miss because they argue only about whether taxing billionaires is fair. Fairness is the decoy issue. Administrative reach is the real issue because once a government normalizes the right to inspect, categorize, and periodically revalue the stock of privately held wealth, that power does not disappear just because you won one election or lost another. It becomes embedded in forms, reporting systems, databases, compliance regimes, and enforcement expectations. Power built this way rarely shrinks voluntarily. That is why I care much more about the mechanism than the first threshold. If the law says 1 billion today, people relax because they are nowhere near it. That is exactly how the mechanism gets through the door. The public hears a number so large they cannot imagine ever being touched. But laws are not only what they are today. Laws are platforms for what future political coalitions can edit tomorrow. That is what history screams. Now let us talk about California, because the source document uses California as the proving ground. Fine, California is a useful case study, not because every policy there automatically becomes national law, but because it often shows what politically ambitious states are willing to test first when revenue hunger gets intense enough. Massive promises, unfunded obligations, administrative bloat, runaway spending, pension pressure, a habit of selling the public one more benefit without honestly pricing the long-term bill. And then the inevitable moment when the math arrives and someone has to decide whether discipline matters after all. Usually discipline loses the vote. That is the real lesson. The source text is very emotional about this, but underneath the anger is a serious fiscal truth. Governments build constituencies around promises long before they build the funding architecture necessary to honor those promises cleanly. Then when the obligations swell and the ordinary tax base is already strained, they start looking upward and outward for new sources. First the slogan, then the moral frame. Then the mechanism, then the threshold ratchet begins. You do not need to agree with every number in the document to understand the logic. Once spending commitments outrun politically comfortable revenue, the temptation to reclassify wealth as taxable inventory becomes much stronger. That is where this is going. And once it goes there, home equity becomes impossible to ignore. This is the fourth mechanism. I call it the fixed asset temptation. Income can move, businesses can relocate, financial assets can be restructured, sheltered, or moved through time. People can change domicile. High earners can leave. Billionaires can fly. But the ordinary homeowner with appreciated equity inside a visible local property is a much easier administrative target. The house is already mapped. The parcel is already recorded. The assessed value is already debated every year. The machinery does not need to be invented from scratch. It only needs political permission to do more. That is why ordinary homeowners should never relax just because the first draft of a policy talks only about the ultra-rich. The house is the obvious bridge from rarefied wealth politics to ordinary asset politics. And once housing becomes politically framed as untapped wealth rather than as family security, the moral language shifts fast. Why should someone sit on all that appreciation and contribute so little? Why should long-time owners enjoy tax advantages while younger families struggle? Why should inherited housing wealth escape the demands placed on earned income? You can hear the script before it is even fully written. That is how the next threshold gets justified. Now, I am not arguing that everyone should panic, sell their home and hide in a cabin. I do not respect panic. I respect structure. That is why I want to make the practical side very clear. If you think the political temperature around wealth, property, and visible assets is rising, then the response is not emotional theater. The response is legal and financial architecture, entity structure, where appropriate trust planning, where appropriate liability management, understanding where title sits, understanding how much naked equity is visible and whether that visibility is strategically wise, understanding state-level exposure, understanding whether a property should be personally held forever or whether family planning goals require something more deliberate. That is adult behavior. The source document talks about war chests of real assets, trusts, LLCs, stripping equity, and credit lines. Some of that language is heated, but the deeper instinct is not foolish. The instinct is to make sure that if the administrative state becomes more interested in visible personal wealth, you are not standing in the open with no plan, except hope. Hope is a weak asset protection strategy. This is the fifth mechanism. I call it the visibility discount. The easier it is for the system to see, classify, and monetize your wealth, the more fragile your ownership becomes in a world of rising fiscal appetite. Visibility has value when you want credit, legal clarity, and clean administration. But visibility also has a cost when governments begin searching for taxable stock rather than taxable flow. That does not mean hide illegally. It means structure intelligently. The same is true for liquidity. People assume the house protects them because it has gone up in nominal value. Fine, but home equity is often rich on paper and poor in practical flexibility. It cannot pay a new wealth levy without refinancing, borrowing, or selling. That is what makes housing such a politically convenient target. The asset is large, visible, and emotionally sticky. People do not want to move. They will absorb pain longer than they should just to stay put. Governments understand this. That is why property-based extraction can grow so quietly. People complain, but they pay. This is what frightens me most about the whole subject, not the rhetoric, the habit. Americans have already been conditioned to accept recurring payment on owned shelter through property tax. They have already been conditioned to accept reassessment. They have already been conditioned to think owning a home still means an annual conversation with the state about what you owe to continue occupying it. Add one more conceptual step and the political imagination changes very quickly. That is the sixth mechanism. I call it ownership drift. Ownership does not usually disappear in one legal explosion. It drifts. First, ownership means you hold title. Then ownership means you hold title but owe annual tax. Then ownership means the assessed value can rise regardless of your income. Then ownership means you may need exemptions, freezes, appeals, lawyers, structures, and planning simply to keep the recurring burden manageable. Eventually, the citizen begins feeling less like an owner and more like the long-term steward of a taxable asset whose terms are set elsewhere. That is not full ownership. That is conditional occupancy with paperwork. And if you think this sounds too dark, look around. More and more households already feel that way. They own homes on paper, yet fear reassessments. Insurance spikes, tax increases, utility shocks, repair costs, and local levies enough that the asset often behaves like a fragile arrangement rather than a fortress. That is not how homeownership was sold. Now let me bring this back to first principles, because that is where the strongest judgment lives. The purpose of accumulated wealth is not to create a more elaborate relationship with the state. The purpose of accumulated wealth is to create margin security, autonomy, and intergenerational transfer. Any system that increasingly treats accumulated wealth as a pool for emergency state extraction changes those goals directly. That is why the conversation matters, even if the first statutory target is far above you, because the first draft teaches the public to accept the philosophy, and once the philosophy is accepted, thresholds become a tactical question. That is the seventh mechanism. I call it the philosophy breach. Laws matter, yes. Rates matter, yes. Thresholds matter, yes. But the largest shift always happens one layer deeper, when the public stops asking whether the state should tax wealth stocks at all and begins arguing only about how much and from whom first. Once that argument is won, the war is mostly over. Everything after that is administration, politics, and time. That is why people who think long-term should pay attention before the threshold touches them personally, not because they are paranoid, because they understand sequence. So here's where I come down. The real threat is not a one-time headline saying a few billionaires will pay more. The real threat is the creation of a replicable framework that allows governments to inspect, value, and justify new claims on what citizens already own. That framework does not stay at the top forever. History says it moves. And when it moves, housing is one of the easiest places for it to land, because houses are visible, emotional, politically defensible targets. Once the moral story is rewritten, that is why ordinary homeowners should care now. Not because tomorrow morning someone seizes the deed, because today is when the mechanism is being normalized. And once a mechanism like that becomes normal, the smartest people do not wait for their threshold to arrive. They structure early. They reduce visibility where lawful and sensible. They build optionality. They study state risk. They stop pretending that private property is secure merely because a title says their name on it, because in the end, the question is not whether a government can tax what you already own. The question is whether it can first persuade enough people that your ownership is really just untapped social inventory waiting to be assessed. That is the battle. And if that battle is lost, the tax bill is just paperwork after the philosophy already won.